And we're back in the car on a Sunday like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday morning here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. We are stepping away from movies, from fitness, from maybe a little mental health, maybe a little general life stuff. We're not going to talk. What we got to talk about? We're not going to talk about any of the usual suspects in this particular episode, but what we will talk about is a pretty big story in New York. Once upon a time, I was a diehard New York Knicks basketball fan. Now, my fandom in basketball, it never reached the heights. If you want to use the word heights, that might be a stretch, but I was never as much of a lunatic basketball fan as baseball. And I freely admit, as much as I love football, I'm a bit of a clown when it comes to being a football fan because I root for both the Jets and the Giants, which I can't be taken seriously. I don't take myself seriously. In the immortal words of Andrew Dice Clay, pick a lane, asshole. But I was never able to do that with football. I like both teams. What can I say? When they play each other, whoever has the ball last, I hope that's the team who wins. But I was a diehard Knicks fan. And as growing up as a Yankees fan, I understood from a pretty young age that the former team owner, the principal owner of the New York Yankees, the legitimate late great George M. Steinbrenner III, he had a reputation for, well, let's just say he had an itchy trigger finger. There's a phrase I love, an itchy trigger finger. It meant that he went through managers faster than other owners, generally speaking. So I grew up with this whole thing where Billy Martin, he's the Yankees manager, he gets fired, he comes back, he gets fired, comes back, he resigns, he comes back. All of this stuff was playing out. But Steinbrenner did have a stretch, late 70s, early 80s, where he was switching managers willy-nilly. He wasn't giving anyone an opportunity to really get a foothold. He's just switching managers. And at a certain point, Steinbrenner, he kind of got religion when he was thrown out of the sport in 1990. And he began to come to the realization that the next manager that I select, I got to give the guy a fair shake. You know, George, as he got older, he seemed to develop just a little bit more patience. And certainly being thrown out of the sport, where he could have been forced to sell the team, he was shook. So his process began to shift. Now, unfortunately, the owner of the New York Knicks, Jim Dolan, I don't know that his process has necessarily shifted. Now, there are times where front office ownership feels as if it's basketball, head coach, if it's baseball, manager, if it's football, head coach. Hockey, same thing, head coach. Baseball is the only American major sport where the guy pulling the strings, hitting the buttons, is called a manager. There are times where ownership is looking for an excuse to fire somebody. George Steinbrenner didn't really need that much in the way of excuses. When it came to Billy Martin was a self-destructive kind of a personality. Nobody ever questioned that he was, from a baseball perspective, he was pretty much of a genius. He was really good. He was a better baseball man than he was a player. I know he won a whole bunch of World Series with the Yankees, but he wasn't really all-star caliber player. He also made one of the single most important catches in Yankees baseball history. They were going to lose the 1952 World Series. In Game 7, there was a high pop-up. I think the Yanks were up by a run. It was a high pop-up in the infield, and no one moved. The ball was the first baseman's ball. Collins. It was Collins' ball at first base, Joe Collins. He didn't see it. Bob Kazava, the pitcher, what a great name, Bob Kazava. I wish I had a name like Bob Kazava. Bob Kazava, the ball was about 2 feet to his left. He froze. Yogi Berra didn't see it. Phil Rizzuto at shortstop. Nobody saw the ball. Billy Martin was like the fifth person who would have a claim on this baseball. And he was the only one who saw it. And when this all happened in a couple of seconds, when he realized that he was the only one on the field who apparently knew where the ball was, he raced in and he made a shoestring catch. It's just an unbelievable play. The Yanks lose that World Series. They don't win 5 World Series in a row, 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952, 53. By the way, Manager Casey Stengel, they didn't fire him until they lost the 1960 World Series. Casey had a nice 11, 12-year run with the Yankees. The old school Yankees believed in continuity. The New York Knicks, the days of Red Holtzman, believed in continuity. Steinbrenner reached a point. The last mistake he made ended up not being such a bad mistake. He didn't bring back Buck Showalter after they flamed out in the 1995 postseason first round. You can argue that Buck didn't manage the bullpen as well as he should have. Now, historically, the problem was Buck had Mariano Rivera, who was already pitching like prime Rivera by the time of the 95 postseason, but Buck didn't know that. His closer all year had been John Wetland, and Wetland had a pretty good year, but he was gassed. He got hit every time he pitched, and Mariano was fucking money. Big surprise, right? One of the top 10 greatest games in the history of the major leagues, Game 2 of the 1995 American League Division Series, Mariano Rivera got the win. He threw 3 scoreless innings against prime Ken Griffey and that crazy Seattle Mariners offense, top 10 great offenses of the last 3 decades. But there's something to be said for not just pulling the trigger, for actually taking some time to think things through, and don't do something that looks really bad, where the optics are indefensible. Letting Buck Showalter just leave was borderline indefensible. The team hadn't gone to a postseason in 14 years. 14 years they had not gone to a postseason. They make the postseason. They come within a hair's breadth of advancing to the second round. They were kind of an undermanned squad that year. They let Showalter go. They didn't fire him. They let him go. Also not the same thing. The Yankees in 2017, they let Girardi go, even though they made it to the American League Championship Series. Does it sound familiar? Knicks fans, sound familiar? But then George got religion. He got religion. Joe Torre had a 12-year reign as Yankees manager, and he left because they didn't bring him back. George didn't fire him. And then the next manager was Joe Girardi, who was not fired. They let him go after they made it to a Game 7 of the American League Championship Series against a really good, I mean, we didn't know what they were doing banging on the trash cans, but a really solid, we can, make jokes all we want. They're a really good team, however you want to look at it. Yeah, they cheated. Yeah, they for sure, but they were still really good because they, the Yankees just, they had opportunities. They could have won the series anyway, regardless of what level of fuckery was going on. The Yankees, though, in that instance, it's similar to what just happened with the Knicks. They decided from an organizational perspective that Girardi was going. They didn't think that he was connecting to the players. They thought that he was overusing certain strategies, and Joe Girardi was a guy who drove me nuts. I never fully embraced him as a manager. I love Buck Showalter, and I was a huge Joe Torre guy. And I happen to really like Aaron Boone. But Aaron Boone's a company man. He's an organizational man. That's why he still has a job, even without any World Series, since starting in 2018. They had a lot of big teams. It's just getting more and more difficult to make a World Series with all these layers of playoffs. It's not an accident. The old Yankees from the first part of the 20th century, they would win their division by 20 games, and then you just got to win 4 out of 7 and you win the World Series. They didn't have to navigate 3 or 4 layers of playoffs. So there's something to be said for not making changes. There's something to be said for listening and saying, hey, if this person is doing their job, why are we firing them? We don't like their process, but we knew who they were when we hired them. Now, my favorite Knicks coach was Rick Pitino. Obviously had a lot more success. He has had more success at the collegiate level. I was devastated when Rick Pitino left. That was the Knicks, same record as this year. The 1988-89 Knicks had a 52-30 record. They weren't title contenders, but they had home court unless they were going to end up playing the Pistons, the eventual winner. And the Knicks had done really well against Detroit that year. There were a lot of people that thought the Knicks were going to beat those Pistons because those Piston teams, they were physical, throw elbows in the lane, but the Knicks were doing that too. The Knicks had an interesting mix that year of, they called it the bomb squad. They were shooting 33s a game, 20 to 33s a game before it was fashionable. But they also had Charles Oakley kind of guys in there in the middle. Charge the lane at your own risk. Oak was going to put you on your bottom, as they say. Like, he was no joke. And Ewing, we all know, was a tough player. that Knicks team should have beaten Jordan's Bulls. They should have won that series. They were a better team. Pippen had gotten there, but he was not the Scottie Pippen that he would become in a couple of years. That was a very beatable Bulls team. They were lucky. That famous shot, Jordan over Craig Elo, the Bulls were kind of lucky to win that series. The Knicks swept the Sixers. You ever wonder why Charles Barkley has seemed to have a problem with the Knicks for decades? Because after sweeping the Sixers, some members of the Knicks stupidly took out a broom and swept it across the Philadelphia Spectrum floor. Really poor taste. But Pitino leaving, there began a carousel of Knicks coaches, guys like John McLeod. It was just one after another until Riley got there. And then Riley left. And you had Don Nelson, Van Gundy. But the whole process here, the idea is that the Knicks franchise has sucked. The Yankees had a lot of lousy years, okay? For after the 64 World Series, or at least you got to a Game 7 of the World Series in 64. And they had some good teams in 1970. Yankees would have easily made a postseason if it was today's structure. The 74 Yankees, and there was one other team in there that would have at least made the postseason. But the Yankees didn't have this enormous, 12 years is a lot. But the Knicks hadn't made the Eastern Conference Finals since what year? You got to go all the way back, right, to the Reggie Miller days. Was it 2003, 2004? It has been a long time since they made the Eastern Conference Finals. When Tom Thibodeau took over the Knicks, it was five years ago, the franchise was in shambles. They sucked. They were a laughingstock. They had been mostly a laughingstock, drafting poorly, making lousy trades that, handcuffed. Because the thing with baseball, and this is true, Steinbrenner made a lot of other mistakes that didn't necessarily cripple the franchise because George didn't worry about such things as caps on spending. The 2005 Yankees, forget dollar for dollar. I think that was the biggest payroll they ever had. Hey, guys like was it Carl Pavano? Carl Pavano, 4 years, $40 million. Man made 27 starts in 4 years. That's not really getting your money's worth, but it's part of the point here. Tom Thibodeau takes the Knicks, and each year they got progressively better. He takes the Knicks to the Eastern Conference Finals. Now, ownership, and Dolan, I assume, was the key guy, obviously, because it's his team. They were convinced that Thibodeau was not the right guy to take them to the next level. That his coaching, I guess, held them back? Most people thought they weren't going to beat the Celtics. Oh, well, maybe the idea is that the Knicks should have been the number one seed and that this was a 60-win team. Now, nobody said this, but you have to assume there's something to it. They're a 60-win team that only won 52 because Thibodeau, I guess, was not a good X's and O's guy. That's what we heard when he came in. That's people say, my God, this guy's a basketball genius. But I guess ownership didn't see it that way. But somehow they signed him to a 3-year, $30 million contract extension, right? It was an extension. So when they let him go earlier this week, they're on the hook for all that money. That's a lot worse, quote unquote, for a guy who got you to the Eastern Conference Finals. You must really think this is the 96 Bulls. You win 52. You beat a heavily favored Celtics team pretty easily in the first round. And you lose a crazy series to the Pacers. So, the question, Chris Mad Dog Russo, who I love, he has a lot of moments where he loses his shit. It was more fun when he was with, Francesa screaming about the Giants, the Mets, the Yankees. This is disgusting. All this stuff. But what Chris Russo said, and I don't think that he certainly wasn't wrong. He said Halliburton's shot hit the back of the rim. Now, if we go through the history of basketball, when a rainbow shot clangs off the back of the rim, it usually doesn't go in. I would say maybe 1 out of 50, maybe even less. That shot goes in. What Russo said is something that I would agree with, even if he hadn't said it. If Halliburton's shot clangs off the back of the rim and does not drop, the Knicks most likely win that series because they'd have game 1 in their column instead of the Pacers column. What could Tom Thibodeau have done about that shot? Oh, well, they shouldn't have been in that position. Well, then I guess all the other teams that Tyrese Halliburton hit crazy circus shots, I guess they shouldn't have been in that position either. John Wooden is not winning that game if that shot goes through. Pat Riley's not winning that game if that shot goes through. That can't be on the coach. The process is not correct. They should not have fired Thibodeau. Now, let's just imagine, we'll reboot this. Let's say that this year's Knicks team didn't win 52. Let's say they won 45. They went 45 and 37, right? Significantly worse. And snuck past the Celtics, didn't dominate them in the way the Knicks had huge stretches of that series where they just outplayed the alleged better team. Then you kind of luck into but how do you luck into the Eastern Conference Final? It's just bad from every angle. Think of it this way. Brian Cashman, the Yankees GM. Now, Hal Steinbrenner is not his father. He has more patience. He believes more in keeping some limits on spending, stay within the luxury tax realm, all of this kind of stuff. But Hal Steinbrenner is not somebody who makes decisions lightly. Unlike his father, he is not prone to being overly aggressive or flying off the handle because one game, one series didn't go the way he wanted it to. Hal is very measured, and I think that his stewardship has been good, even though they haven't won a World Series since George passed, which was in 2010. But Hal and his brother Hank, who unfortunately passed, they were running the team. So, I mean, I can give Hal and Hank, in memoriam, but I can give Hal credit for what they did. But Brian Cashman, the Yankees GM, he's been the Yankees GM for 27 years. Continuity. Now, there are all kinds of Yankees fans, my cousin being one of them, if you're watching or listening, who have been calling for Cashman to be fired since at least the mid-2000s. But from the Yankees' perspective, from the organizational perspective, they don't do that unless they think there is an actual reason. They don't believe that, well, we need to fire the GM to change things up. The organizational model does not shift. And they continue to feel, Hal continues to feel, that Cashman is the guy to fulfill what they're trying to do here. So I mentioned the difference between letting Joe Girardi go, letting Joe Torre go after that terrible loss in 2007 to the Cleveland Indians at the time, now the Guardians. Now, Joe Torre, as I say, love the guy, won 4 World Series. The Yankees had big teams every single year. They were World Series contenders. I don't think they had a season in the Torre era where they didn't win at least 90 games. I mean, that, again, you're not supposed to do that. That's not baseball, Susan. That's not how it goes, even if you can spend all the money that you want. But talk about organizations getting angry about one individual game and now we're going to fire this guy or whatever. Because Steinbrenner was the sort of person who would do that. George, that is. So in game 2 of the 2007 American League Division Series, the Yanks got smashed. They got blown out of game 1. But game 2, they had a 1-run lead, bottom of the 8th inning. And they brought in a pitcher who we thought he was going to be a big pitcher for, at least a decade. Jabba Chamberlain didn't really work out. He hurt his arm, he hurt his elbow, hurt his shoulder. Didn't really have that much of a career, unfortunately. He was kind of a character, likable guy, I thought. Jabba Chamberlain, there was this crazy swarm of midges, these little disgusting bugs that attacked the players. And when I say attack, they weren't biting them, but they're all over them. And I remember watching that and saying out loud, because I was in a bar setting, I was at an Outback Steakhouse and a whole bunch, we're all watching the game. Torre needs to take his team off the field. He needs to get his team off the field. So Torre came out and said, can we get our team off the field? My pitcher's got 500 fucking bugs on him. No, we can't give you permission. Play ball. Joe Torre should have not said to the umpire, fuck you, but he should have turned around and said, that's not going to work. This is unacceptable, unplayable. And Torre should have taken the team off the field. And I remember saying that at the time, this is unplayable. Take your team back to the clubhouse until these bees leave. And if you get forfeited, it ain't going to stand because there's no way any league office is going to be okay with continuing to play in this nonsense. So Torre didn't do that. The Yanks ended up losing that game and they lost the series in 4. Now, he was not invited back. And if they say part of it was that he didn't just take the team off the field and take his chances, I got no problem. Because he didn't get fired. They simply didn't renew his contract. He said that is his one regret in an entire managerial career. I should have taken my guys off the field And we should have just rolled a dice because that was unplayable for both teams. I regret that. He got fired. After the 2017 season, the Yankees knew they were not bringing back Joe Girardi. And what Brian Cashman said about it, he said, we had made the organizational decision during the season that unless we made it to the World Series. And Cashman was almost joking when he said, if we go to the World Series, there's no way we could ever justify firing, or in this instance, not firing, not bringing back the manager. We may have thought at the time that Joe's methods were not where we wanted to be. We wanted somebody who could, adapt to circumstance, but somebody who understood metrics in the way that Aaron Boone did and still does. But to me, it was always more, and has been more, that Boone is just a company guy. He's a push-button manager, and I think that's why he survived. But in the case of the Knicks, the problem is that you say stuff like, well, we think that Bridges and Brunson played too many minutes. Hey, Pat Riley played a really short bench too. And nobody said, well, he doesn't really understand how to manage the bench. You got to have good players. Jeff Van Gundy, when the Knicks, the kind of Ewing, the second glory years with Ewing, if you want to call it that, when Van Gundy was calling the shots, that's the stay on the bench year, 1997, he also played a pretty short bench. You run your horses, you go with your horses. That's how basketball is. They say, well, he didn't really know how to manage a bench. That's amazing. I mean, that's an amazing takeaway. You signed a guy to a contract, $30 million. Your team exceeded expectations for this season. They lost a really tough series, a couple of bounces, which have nothing to do with the coach's process or the fact that we think that he got outmaneuvered. I mean, give me a fucking break. There are series you could point to where Pat Riley got outmaneuvered. And Pat Riley is an absolute genius in basketball. Sometimes your moves just don't work. And man, the Knicks better come up with a home run hitter. You better come up with a Pat Riley, although it's not going to be Pat, that's for sure. How do you sell this to your fan base? Because you can see on social media and in the newspapers, fan base isn't buying it. Thibodeau doesn't seem like necessarily a warm and fuzzy kind of a personality, but he was very well respected and appreciated and beloved in many quarters because of the way he seemed to change the culture of the team. Joe Girardi did not change the culture of the Yankees. The Yankees had a winning culture. Buck Showalter left the organization winners, making the first playoffs in 14 years. Joe Torre left in 2007. He left a 93-94 win team for Jolton Joe Girardi. I mean, I like Girardi as a player. I just didn't think he was that great of a manager because he had this stat book like this. And he was the sort of guy, if somebody was 0 for 3 against a relief pitcher, he'd pinch hit for him. Drove you nuts. That's not metrics. That's just basically nonsense, Who knows where this goes? Maybe Jim Dolan, in this one instance, is going to look like a genius. They bring in a new manager and, they bring in a new head coach and the team goes to the finals next year. Right? It's possible. I got to tell you, when Showalter wasn't brought back, that's going to be 30 years in October when we realized Buck wasn't coming back. And here comes Joe Torre. I thought that was a disaster. I didn't like Joe Torre. He managed the Mets. The Mets lost 100 games. He managed the Braves, and there were people who said he didn't get as much out of those teams as he should have. He went to one postseason. Joe famously had never gone to a World Series. Just a crazy amount of games between his playing and coaching and managing career. But that ended up being a masterstroke. Does Jim Dolan really have something like that in him? I don't know. Seems to be a stretch. But even though I don't really root anymore, I mean, I was passively observing the series, the Knicks and Celtics and then Pacers, but I didn't watch any of the games. I might catch some highlights. It's just not my sport. But I appreciate the passion of the fans, people lighting up social media, and also, to be fair, the people who have lit up social media agreeing with, Dolan didn't say this, agreeing with what seems to be the prevailing sentiment that they just felt that the way that some of the players talked about things which Thibodeau needed to improve, they didn't think that he was in a place where he could. I understand that. There are some people who feel like it's time, but that they better get somebody at least comparable to Thibodeau. But we'll see. That's what makes a horse race, right? Somebody's got to go. If the organization decides to go in another direction, you can't fire all of the players, the manager, the head coach, the defensive coordinator, et cetera, the bench coach. That's who ends up facing the axe. But you know what? Thibodeau walks out with what amounts to a $30 million golden parachute, and he'll land on his feet. He really is a terrific coach. Even somebody who hasn't followed closely like myself can tell. Players respected him, and he never looks like on the bench. He never looks as if he's lost at sea. So here's my take on the firing of Tom Thibodeau and the conceptual notion from the managerial ownership perspective. When is a good time? When is a good time to fire a coach, a manager? It's usually not when they make the first championship series in quite some time or Eastern Conference Finals in more than 2 decades. This has been episode 556 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Sunday morning here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then,